Hello, friends, and let's get started.
Emily sat in the kitchen, staring out the window where the rain was falling slowly behind the glass. She was holding a cup of the herbal tea that Jake had urged her to drink every day. "It's good for the baby," he'd said, and she nodded obediently, though she couldn't look at the tea without irritation. She sighed, set the cup on the table, and reached for the cigarette she had hidden in her desk drawer. But then she stopped, remembering that Jake could walk in at any moment. He was everywhere she didn't want him to be. In the morning, he'd wake her up with breakfast in bed and omelet with vegetables, because protein is important for a baby's development. In the afternoon, he would call to remind her that she needed to go for a walk because fresh air is good for you. In the evening, he would read her articles about pregnancy while she tried to concentrate on a book she had long wanted to finish. She felt her identity dissolving in this endless stream of caring. She wasn't Emily anymore. She was mom-to-be, and that title seemed to have completely consumed her. Jake walked into the kitchen, holding a new book in his hands. "Amy, look at this," he said, opening it to a page with a brightly colored illustration. "It says here that at this stage, the baby can already hear your voice. We should start talking to him. You can read aloud to him, or I can." She wasn't listening. Her gaze slid over his face, over his eyes that shone with such enthusiasm that it almost hurt her. She wanted to scream, "Stop it. Stop being so perfect. Stop thinking only about the baby." But instead she just smiled and said, "Sure, Jake. That sounds wonderful." He sat down next to her and put his hand on her stomach, as if he could already feel life there. "You know, I think we should start picking out a name. Why don't we sit down tonight and make a list? I've already started sketching something out." Emily closed her eyes. She wanted to get up and run out of the house, anywhere, just to avoid hearing this. But she stayed where she was because she knew if she said anything, he'd be offended. He always took offense when she tried to explain that she needed some space. "You're just tired," he'd say. "It's hormones. It'll pass." But it never did. On the contrary, her irritation grew with each passing day. She caught herself daydreaming about something that wasn't about the baby, about the house, about Jake. Something that belonged to her alone. The next day, she went to a maternity class. Jake wanted to go with her, but she insisted she could handle it on her own. "You know how much I love you," he said, kissing her forehead. "But if you need anything, call me. I'm always in touch." In class, she sat in the corner, trying not to draw attention to herself. But then a man approached her. He was tall, with a slight unshaven face and a smile that seemed all too natural for this place. "Hi," he said. "I'm Nick. Are you here to learn how to breathe properly during labor, too?" She laughed. His tone was light, almost joking, and it was so unlike anything she'd heard lately. "Emily," she introduced herself. "And yes, apparently that's what I'm here for." They got to talking. Nick turned out to be everything she'd always imagined a free man to be. He joked, talked about his travels, about how he'd once almost fallen out of a parachute. Emily caught herself laughing, and the feeling was so unfamiliar that she was almost afraid. When the course was over, Nick offered to take her out for coffee. "You know pregnant women can't have caffeine, right?" He joked, and she laughed again. "I think once is okay," she replied, feeling something inside her come alive. They sat in the coffee shop, and Emily suddenly realized that she didn't want this conversation to end. Nick talked about life like it was an adventure, not a to-do list. And she caught herself thinking that it had been a long time since anyone had looked at her the way he did. Not as a mom-to-be, but just as a woman. When she got home, Jake met her at the door. "How'd it go?" he asked, helping her take off her jacket. "You look tired. Maybe you need to lie down." She looked at him and suddenly felt her irritation rising with renewed vigor. "I'm fine, Jake," she said, trying to speak calmly. "I just want to be alone for a while." He frowned, but didn't argue. "All right," he said, "but if anything, I'm here for you." She closed herself in the bedroom, sat on the bed, and pulled out her phone. On the screen was a new message from Nick. "It was nice to meet you. Should we do it again?" Emily froze. Her fingers trembled as she typed a reply, "Let's." And in that moment, she realized that something inside her had already changed. Something she wouldn't be able to stop. Emily sat on the couch, covered in a plaid blanket, and stared at her phone screen. The messages from Nick came more and more often, and every time she saw his name on the screen, her heart beat a little faster. At first they were just jokes, light questions about her day, then more personal conversations. He talked about his dreams, about how he'd once quit his job and gone to Asia without a plan. She caught herself envying his freedom, his ability to live the life he wanted. "Have you ever thought of just picking up and leaving?" he asked one day. She wondered. She used to dream of traveling, of new experiences, but now her life seemed so predictable, so boring. "Sometimes," she replied. "But now, with a child, it's impossible." "Why impossible?" He wrote. "Life doesn't end with the birth of a child. It just becomes different." Those words hurt her. She began to think that maybe he was right. Maybe she hadn't been living her life all this time. Whose? Jake's? A baby that hadn't even been born yet? Jake walked into the room, and she quickly turned off her phone screen. "Who are you texting with?" he asked, sitting down next to her. "With a friend," she answered, trying to sound calm. "We're discussing baby stuff." He nodded, but something flashed in his eyes that she couldn't read. "You know, I think we should get a new stroller. I looked at the reviews, and—" She wasn't listening. Her thoughts were far away, in her correspondence with Nick, in the words he'd written, "You deserve more than just being a mom." The next day, she went to class again. Nick was waiting for her at the entrance. "Hi," he said, smiling. "I was wondering if we could go out after class. Just not to a coffee shop. Maybe to the park." She hesitated. Jake was waiting for her at home. He was starting to worry if she was late. But at the same time, she felt she couldn't say no. "All right," she said, "but not for long." They walked around the park, and Nick talked about his plans for the future. He talked about how he wanted to start his own business, how he dreamed of a life without borders. Emily listened, and she felt like she was breathing in a breath of fresh air after being in a stuffy room for so long. "And you?" he asked suddenly. "What do you dream of?" She froze. That question caught her off guard. What had she dreamed about? She couldn't remember. "I don't know," she admitted. "I think I've forgotten." He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her heart clench. "You don't have to forget," he said quietly. "You deserve to dream." When she got home, Jake was waiting for her with dinner. "Where have you been?" he asked, trying to speak calmly, but you could hear the tension in his voice. "You didn't answer my messages." "I was with a friend," she said, avoiding his gaze. "We were walking in the park." He looked at her, and she felt her heart start to beat faster. "With which friend?" he asked. "With Lisa," she lied, saying the name of the first one that came to mind. "She's pregnant too? We just decided to go for a walk." Jake nodded, but she could see he didn't believe it. He didn't say anything, but his silence was louder than any words. Emily went to bed, but she couldn't sleep. Her phone was on a nightstand, and she knew Nick would text. She knew she wouldn't be able to resist, and she knew this was just the beginning. When the phone vibrated, she picked it up. "Sleeping?" Nick texted. She looked over at Jake, who was sleeping next to her, and quietly got out of bed. "No," she replied. "I was thinking about you," he wrote. "About the way you smile when you talk about something you care about." She felt her heart clench. She knew this was wrong. She knew it could ruin everything. But at the same time, she couldn't stop. "I've been thinking about you too," she wrote. And in that moment, she realized she couldn't go back. Something inside her was broken, and she didn't know how to fix it. Emily sat in the cafe, nervously rubbing the edge of her napkin. There was tea in front of her, which she hadn't even touched. Nick sat across from her, his eyes watching her with such attention that she felt as if he could see right through her. They'd been talking for over an hour now, and the conversation was getting more personal by the minute. He talked about his fears, about how he was afraid he would never find someone who would understand him. She listened, and she felt like he was speaking in her words. "And you?" he asked suddenly. "Are you afraid of something?" She froze. The question caught her off guard. She began, but her voice trembled. "I'm afraid that I'm going to lose myself. That I'm no longer Emily, but just a mom, a wife, a housewife. That I'll never be me again." Nick reached across the table and covered her palm with his. "You won't lose yourself," he said quietly. "You're too strong for that." She felt her heart begin to beat faster. His touch was warm, soothing, and at the same time it was like it was igniting something inside her. She wanted to pull her hand away, but she couldn't. "I don't know what's happening to me," she whispered. "I feel like I'm losing control." Maybe that's not a bad thing, he said. Maybe it just means you're starting to live. She looked up at him, and in that moment she realized she couldn't resist anymore. She wanted this. Wanted it. Wanted to feel alive. Wanted important. Not just a mom-to-be, but a woman. When they left the cafe, he suggested a walk. She knew it was wrong. She knew she should say no. But instead she nodded. They walked down the street, and with each step the tension between them grew. He was telling her something, but she was barely listening. Her thoughts were occupied with only one thing. What would happen next? She could feel her body reacting to his closeness, her heart beating faster and faster. When they stopped in front of his car, he looked at her. "Emily," he said quietly, "are you sure you want to do this?" She froze. Her mind screamed that this was wrong, that she was destroying everything she had. But her body, her heart, her soul, everything in her was screaming, yes. She nodded. Jake sat at home, nervously thumbing through the papers on his desk. Emily was late, and he couldn't figure out why. He'd called her, but she hadn't answered. His thoughts were jumbled, and he could feel the anxiety growing inside him. He stood up and started pacing around the room. His gaze fell on her cell phone, which she had left at home. He hesitated, but then picked it up. He knew the password. It was the date of their wedding. He opened the correspondence and started reading. At first it was just messages from girlfriends, but then he saw a name that told him nothing. Nick. He opened the correspondence and started reading. With each message his heart squeezed tighter and tighter. It talked about dreams, about fears about life. And with each word, he realized this was more than just friendship. He put the phone down on the table and closed his eyes. His hands were shaking, and the only thought going through his head was, she's cheating on me. He grabbed his keys and walked out of the house. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't sit around and wait. He has to find her. He has to figure out what's going on. Emily lay in bed, listening to Nick breathing next to her. She felt guilty, but at the same time, a strange sense of release. She felt alive again. Felt like she was her again. Her cell phone vibrated. She looked at the screen and saw a message from Jake. "Where are you?" She froze. Her heart began to beat faster. She knew she should answer, but she didn't know what to say. "I'll be home soon," she texted. She got up and started to get dressed. Nick looked at her, but didn't say anything. When she was ready to leave, he took her hand. "Emily," he said quietly, "are you sure you want to go back to him?" She looked up at him, and there was so much pain in her eyes that he let go of her hand. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know what I want." Emily got into the car, her hands still shaking and one thought pulsing in her head. What have I done? She started the engine, but couldn't move. Her gaze fell to the rearview mirror, and she saw her reflection eyes full of confusion, lips still bearing the traces of his kisses. She closed her eyes, trying to drown out the voice of reason that screamed that she was destroying everything she had. But another voice, quiet but insistent, whispered, "You deserve to be happy. You deserve to feel alive." She abruptly turned off the ignition and got out of the car. Her feet carried her back to the door of Nick's apartment on their own. She didn't think, didn't analyze, she just walked, obeying that inner urge that was stronger than fear, stronger than guilt, stronger than anything. She knocked on the door. Nick opened it almost immediately, as if he'd been expecting her. His eyes were full of questions, but he said nothing. She walked in, and the door closed behind her. The apartment was quiet, only their breathing breaking the silence. Nick stood in front of her, his hands gently resting on her shoulders. "Emily," he began, but she interrupted him by raising her hand. "Don't tell me," she whispered. "Just don't speak." He obeyed. His hands slid down and wrapped around her waist, and she felt her body respond to his touch. She knew this was wrong. She knew it would ruin everything. But in this moment, she didn't care. She needed this, his warmth, his closeness, his attention. She needed to feel like she was still a woman, not just a mom-to-be. He leaned in, and their lips met. This kiss was different, more passionate, more desperate. She felt her mind shutting down, everything around her ceasing to exist. Her arms reached for him, wrapped around his neck, pulled him closer. He lifted her in his arms, and she wrapped her legs around him. They moved toward the bedroom without breaking their kiss. She could feel her heart beating so hard it felt like it was about to burst out her chest. She knew it was wrong, but in this moment, she didn't care. Jake sat in the car, his fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. He was driving home, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His thoughts kept returning to the correspondence he'd seen on her phone, to that name Nick, to the words they'd written to each other. He stopped at a stoplight and closed his eyes. He tried to convince himself that this was all just his paranoia, that Emily wasn't capable of such a thing. But deep down, he knew she wasn't. When he got home, the apartment was empty. He called out to her, but there was no answer. His heart began to beat faster. He pulled out his phone and dialed her number. She didn't answer. He sat down on the couch and covered his face with his hands. His thoughts were confused, and he could feel the anxiety growing inside him. He knew he had to do something. But what? When Emily got home, Jake discreetly picked up her cell phone. He decided to check it out. The screen glowed in the darkness, illuminating his face, which read a mixture of shock, pain, and anger. He reread the last message from Nick over and over. "I miss you. When will I see you again?" His fingers trembled as he scrolled up through the correspondence, seeing how their communication became more and more personal, how words turned into confessions and then into plans. He closed his eyes, trying to drown out the wave of rage that was rising in him. But it was too strong. He wanted to scream, wanted to smash something, but instead he just sat there, clutching his phone. Emily entered the room, carrying a cup of tea. She stopped on the threshold when she saw his face. Her gaze fell on the phone in his hands, and she realized without words. The cup slipped out of her hands and shattered on the floor, but neither of them paid attention. "Jake," she began, but her voice shook. "I can explain." He raised his eyes to her. There was such pain in them that she felt her heart clench. "Explain," he said quietly. "Explain how you could do this." She knelt before him, her hands trembling. "It was a mistake," she whispered. "I didn't mean for it to end this way. I was confused. I was so lonely, and he was just there for me." Jake looked at her, his heart torn between anger and love. He wanted to scream at her, wanted to blame her for everything. But at the same time, he saw her eyes full of tears and felt his heart clench with pain. "You cheated on me," he said, and his voice was quiet but full of pain. "You cheated on me when we're expecting a baby. How could you?" She covered her face with her hands. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know what came over me. I felt that I was losing myself, that I was no longer Emily, but just a mom, a wife, a housewife. I'm not making excuses for myself, but I don't know." He was silent, his thoughts confused. He knew he had to be strong, had to protect himself, but at the same time he was thinking about the baby, about what they had created together. He couldn't just walk away, but he couldn't forgive her either. "I don't know what to do," he said finally. "I don't know how to live with it." She looked up at him, and there was pleading in her eyes. "Jake, please," she whispered. "Let's try to start over. I'll do anything to make it right. Please." He closed his eyes, feeling the tears coming up. "I don't know, Emily," he said. "I don't know if I can trust you." Their relationship had been cold and strained ever since. They lived under the same roof, but there was a wall between them that neither of them could overcome. Jake tried to be there for her, but every time he looked at her, he saw her with Nick. He heard her laughter, her words, and he felt like they weren't addressed to him. Emily, for her part, felt like she was in a cage. She knew she had ruined everything they had, but at the same time, she couldn't shake the thought that Nick was her chance at happiness. She continued to secretly text him, but she was more careful now. She deleted messages, changed passwords, tried not to leave any traces. But Jake sensed something was wrong. He noticed the way she nervously checked her phone, how quickly she left the room when he came in. He knew she was hiding something, but he couldn't prove it. One night, when she came out of the bathroom, he picked up her phone. She froze when she saw it. "Jake," she started, but he interrupted her. "Don't," he said quietly. "I just want to check your correspondences and what you're hiding from me." He opened the correspondence, but there was nothing there. She had deleted everything. He looked at her, and there was such pain in his eyes that she felt her heart clench. "You're still communicating with him," he said. "I know that. I can feel it." She was silent, not knowing what to say. She knew he was right, but she couldn't admit it. She was afraid that if she told the truth, he would leave. and she couldn't let that happen. Labor started suddenly, in the middle of the night. Emily woke Jake, her voice calm but panic in her eyes. He jumped out of bed, grabbed the bag he'd packed, and helped her to the car. He held her hand all the way to the hospital, tried to reassure her, but he could feel his heart beating so hard that it felt like it was about to burst out of his chest. In the delivery room, he stood beside her, holding her hand as she screamed in pain. He felt helpless, but tried to be strong for her. When the first cry of their baby finally sounded, he felt tears come to his eyes. He looked at Emily, expecting to see the same joy in her eyes that had overwhelmed him. But her face was calm, almost detached. "It's a boy," the doctor said, handing the baby into her arms. "Congratulations." She took the baby, but her gaze was blank. Jake leaned over to kiss her forehead, but she pulled away slightly. "I'm tired," she whispered. "I need to rest." He nodded, but something inside him clenched. He'd hoped that having a baby would bring them closer together, that they could start over. But instead, he felt the wall between them only getting higher. Things had changed at home, but not in the way he'd expected. Emily had become even colder, even more distant. She cared for the baby, but she did it mechanically, as if it were her duty, not her joy. Jake tried to help, but every time he offered to hold the baby or change a diaper, she refused. "I can do it myself," she said. "You don't know how." He felt like an extra in his own home. He tried to talk to her, try to understand what was going on, but she would shut up or say everything was fine. But he knew it wasn't. He saw her secretly texting someone. He knew it was Nick. One night, when the baby finally fell asleep, he sat next to her on the couch. "Emily," he began, "we need to talk." She didn't respond, continuing to stare at the television, though it was obvious she wasn't listening to him. "Emily," he repeated, more insistently this time. "I know you're still communicating with him." She froze, but didn't turn toward him. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quietly. "You don't have to lie," he said, and his voice trembled. "I see the way you hide your phone, the way you leave the room when I come in. I'm not blind, Emily. I know you're still with him." She closed her eyes, and he saw the tears rolling down her cheeks. "Jake," she whispered, "I don't know what to do. I feel so lost. I love our son, but I don't know if I love you." His heart clenched with pain. He knew this could happen, but hearing it was unbearable. "Do you want to go to him?" he asked, trying to speak calmly, but his voice trembled. She was silent, and her silence was the answer. He felt something inside him break. "Why didn't you leave sooner?" he asked. "Why didn't you tell me this before we had a child?" She looked at him, and there was pain in her eyes. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I thought things would get better. I thought having a baby would change everything. But nothing has changed. I still feel trapped." He closed his eyes, feeling the tears coming up. "You're destroying our family," he said. "You're destroying everything we had." She didn't answer, just sat there, staring into emptiness. He stood up and walked out of the room, feeling his heart being torn apart. Emily was left alone, her thoughts confused. She knew she had to make a choice, but she was afraid of the consequences. She loved Nick, but she was afraid of destroying her family for him. She thought about the baby, about how his life would change if she left. But at the same time, she felt she couldn't go on living in this marriage where she felt so alone. She picked up her phone and opened her correspondence with Nick. "I don't know what to do," she wrote. "I feel so lost." He replied almost immediately. "You deserve to live the life you want," he wrote. She closed her eyes, feeling her heart clench. She knew he was right, but she also knew that her choice would destroy everything she had. And in that moment, she realized she could no longer continue to live this lie. She had to make a choice. But which one? The fight erupted suddenly, like a fire that smoldered beneath the ashes for a long time. Jake, tired of her coldness and detachment, finally couldn't take it anymore. "You don't even look at me," he said, his voice shaking with restrained emotion. "You're not even trying. What's wrong with you, Emily? What have I done wrong?" She stood in front of him, her hands clenched into fists and her eyes full of tears. "You didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. "It's me. I can't pretend anymore, Jake. I can't, and I don't want to." He looked at her, and there was a mixture of pain and anger in his eyes. "Pretend?" he repeated. "So all this time, you've just been pretending? Our marriage, our baby, was it all an act?" She closed her eyes. No, she said quietly. Not all of it. I love our son. But you, I don't love you anymore, Jake. And I can't keep living that lie. He recoiled as if her words had hit him. You're leaving for him, aren't you? He asked, his voice hoarse. To that. Nick, she nodded, unable to look him in the eye. I don't know what's going to happen next, she whispered. But I know I can't stay here. I have to try. He remained silent. He could feel something breaking inside him, but he couldn't find the words. Finally, he just turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone. Emily packed her things for the next morning. She took only the essentials, leaving everything that reminded her of their life together. Jake sat in the kitchen, holding their son in his arms. He didn't look at her as she walked by, but she could feel his gaze on her back. I'm going to visit my baby, she said quietly. He's still my son. Jake didn't answer. He just sat there, staring into emptiness as she walked out the door. Nick was waiting for her by the car. He smiled when he saw her, but his smile was strained. Are you sure you want to do this? He asked, helping her put her bag in the trunk. She looked up at him, and there was a mixture of hope and fear in her eyes. I don't know, she whispered, but I know I can't stay there. He nodded, but there was something in his eyes that she couldn't understand. They got into the car, and he started the engine. Emily stared out the window, feeling her heart beating so hard it felt like it was about to burst out her chest. Jake was alone, holding their son in his arms. He felt devastated, but at the same time, strangely liberated. He knew their relationship was doomed long ago, but still the pain was unbearable. He looked at the baby, who slept peacefully in his arms. We'll get through this, he whispered. We'll make it. Emily sat in the car, staring at the road. She felt her heart clench with fear and doubt. She thought about Jake, about their son, about what she had left behind. But most of all, she thought about Nick. Was he who she'd imagined him to be? Or was he just an illusion she'd created to escape reality? She didn't know, but she did know that she could never go back. She had made her choice, and now all she had to do was live with the consequences. A few months passed. Jake sat on a park bench, watching his son, little Jacob, try to take his first steps. Sitting next to him was Lisa, a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes. Her daughter, Sophie, was playing in the sandbox with Jacob, their laughter echoing throughout the park. Lisa put her hand on Jake's shoulder. He's so strong, she said, smiling. Soon he'll be running faster than us. Jake smiled, but there was a shadow of sadness in his eyes. He was still thinking about Emily, about how she'd left, leaving their son behind. But he felt calmer with Lisa. She understood his pain because she had gone through a similar divorce herself. They found support and understanding in each other, and their relationship gradually grew into something more. Emily sat in the small apartment she rented with Nick. She stared out the window, listening to him talking on the phone in the next room. Their relationship, which had seemed like an escape to her, now felt like a prison. Nick was different, not the man she'd envisioned him to be. He was selfish, often disappearing for days at a time without explaining where he'd been. And when she tried to talk to him, he waved her off, saying she was too demanding. She picked up her phone and opened the pictures of Jacob. Her heart ached as she looked at his smile. She regretted her decision, but she knew she couldn't go back. Jake wouldn't forgive her. And did she deserve to be forgiven? One night when Nick disappeared again, she dialed Jake's number. He didn't answer right away, and her heart raced when she heard his voice. Jake, she began, her voice shaking. I wanted to talk. He was silent for a few seconds before answering. Emily, he finally said, what's wrong? She closed her eyes, feeling tears roll down her cheeks. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry for everything. I want to go back. I want to be with you and Jacob. He sighed, and there was a mixture of pain and regret in his voice. Emily, he said quietly, you made your choice. And I made mine too. Lisa and I are serious. We're happy, and Jacob's happy. I can't go back to the way things were. She felt her heart break. Please, she whispered. I'll do anything to make it right. That's no longer possible, he said. We have to move forward. And so must you. He hung up, and she was alone, holding the phone in her trembling hands. She knew he was right. She had made her choice, and now all she had to do was live with the consequences. Jake put the phone down and looked at Lisa, who was playing with the kids on the floor. She looked up at him and smiled. "Everything okay?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Everything's fine." He walked over to her, took her hand, and helped her up. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." She smiled and kissed his cheek. "We'll get through this," she said. Together. Jake looked over at Jacob and Sophie, who were laughing as they played in the sandbox. He knew his life would never be the same again, but he also knew that he had a chance to start over. And he was ready to do that, with Lisa, with their children, with their new family. Emily sat in the empty apartment, listening to the rain rustling outside the window. She knew her life had changed forever, but she also knew she had to find the strength to move forward. She picked up her phone and opened the pictures of Jacob. "I love you," she whispered, "and I'll always be your mom." She closed her eyes, feeling the tears roll down her cheeks. But in that moment, she realized that the tears weren't the end. It was the beginning of something new, and she was ready to begin. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.